right, so as we talked about last time, we have a guest today. This is Dr. Louise Wheeler, and she completed her PhD here at BYU in clinical psychology, and she is now an assistant clinical professor and psychologist, and she's still with us here, fortunately, at BYU. And her areas of special interest are multicultural issues in the experience of people of color, women's issues, trauma, eating disorders, depression, couples therapy, and chronic mental illness. And her primary theoretical orientation as a therapist is humanistic or emotion-focused therapy. And she's graciously agreed to come and talk with us today about race and the family to help us in our discussion. So thank you, Louise, for being here.
Okay, hi everyone. Okay, so I have a few slides and a few things that I want to touch on, but please feel free to ask any question you might have as we go. The more interactive, I think, the better, but that's me. Okay, so there's a couple of things I want to tell you about myself before I tell you about the topic. The reason for that is race is a topic that I do research on, and I do a lot of my clinical work with people of color. And one thing that's pretty clear in the research is that it's impossible for people of color to separate their experience as individuals from their daily work experience, and especially in academia when it comes to research and things like that. And so to give you a little bit of context into what I'm going to be talking about, I just wanted to give you a little bit more details about me. So like your professor said, I'm a clinical psychologist. I graduated 2 years ago? No, last year, 2017, whenever that was. And I specialize clinically. I specialize in sexual trauma and race-related stress, and then research-wise, most of my research is on race and gender. So I was born and raised in France, but my parents are not French. So just to give you a little bit of context, so I grew up in, has anyone been in France? Okay, you have. So I grew up in the south, like right here in Marseille. And I came to the US 7 years ago. And so I'm a French citizen, and my parents are immigrants. So my dad is from Cape Verde, which is right here. And if you watch General Conference, they're getting a temple, which is cool because Portugal, who colonized Cape Verde, doesn't have a temple. So that's kind of a cool thing. And then my mom is Italian. And so I grew up within a lot of cultural there were a lot of conflicts between the two families, not between my parents, but between grandparents and uncles and aunts. And so I grew up French with two very different cultural influences, especially my dad's family, my African family, had a lot of influence in the things that we did. We spent most of our time with them. So that influences and informs a lot of the research and the work that I do. Before talking about family and kind of as a transition, a lot of the research that I focused on last year was about the experience of students of color at BYU. And hopefully that's a study we can kind of expand on other campuses. So we're focusing on predominantly white institutions, which BYU is a predominantly white institution with about 82 to 83% white students. And so some of the challenges that came up in the study that we did and that are pretty consistent with the research is that students of color experience more social isolation than their white peers, which means that they have a hard time finding supports, and usually institutions are not really good at providing the support that they need, but also that they often feel singled out in the classroom, so where it's harder for them to find study groups, or they find that when they are in a study group, there's a few more challenges that they experience when it comes to like trust, like their peers don't necessarily trust them with work and things like that. But then also the other side of the problem is tokenization, where often they'll be kind of put in a tricky situation where if a professor is talking about let's say African American experience about whatever, and there's one African American student in the class, often they'll be kind of put on the spot and expected to talk about their experience as if it was the same for all the African American students. They experience a lot of microaggressions from peers, but also from faculty members, and then they're expected to assimilate kind of to the campus culture when the campus is not willing to reach out and kind of assess whatever their needs might be. And often their belonging at the institution will be questioned. A lot of the students I work with here hear pretty consistently from white students on campus that they only got in because of affirmative action, which if you look into what affirmative action is, it just doesn't work like that. Like you don't just get in because you're Black or Asian or Latino or Latina. But and so often their academic performance and competence will be questioned. And so the impact that has on them is it makes them question themselves, right, often. And also it has a negative impact on their academic performance. The higher levels of racial stress or race-related stress students are experiencing, the higher every other kind of stress is going to be. They feel isolated, lonely, and often this ends up in transferring to other institutions where they might find more support or having a slower academic and professional start, which means having a harder time finding mentors, building connections with faculty members and things like that. So here I want to be careful, and I want you to really remember that this is not the experience of everyone that's a student of color. This is the average experience. But that doesn't mean that every single student of color at a predominantly white institution is going to feel this way. But that's kind of the consistent things that come up from the research. So one of the things that we are interested in looking into is how students cope. And what we know is that the coping skills of young adults of color are influenced by their community and their family. So what this means is, for example, a student that comes from a background where their family kind of pushed hard work, and we don't complain about this. This is a reality. Racism is a reality for us, but we just push through and prove everyone wrong, which is often what parents will tell first generation college students. What we know is that those students will do the same thing in college. They just push through, attempt to prove everyone wrong, prove that they belong at the institution, prove that they're where they're supposed to be, but often that's at the expense of their mental, emotional, and physical health, and so often they'll burn out and be exhausted. What we also look into is, are the skills adaptive or maladaptive, meaning are they serving the students in a positive way or more in a negative way? And then what are those skills accomplishing for the student, right? And so I run a support group at BYU for students of color, and that's a topic that we often talk about. They'll talk about feeling like one way for them to cope is to stand up for themselves in class, right? But often that leads to more isolation and less support. And another one that they talked about is the one I told you about a few minutes ago, where I'm just going to graduate with straight A's and get a really good job, so everyone, like, this is just the best revenge kind of thing, like, if for me to be successful. But that kind of ignores a lot of the systemic issues that are maintaining their experience, and I'll say a little bit more about that. But so that's kind of what bridging into talking about families, what I think is important to look at when it comes to race and family is, how is the family racial background influencing the functioning of the individual in the moment. So just a few things here, and I'm sure a lot of you will be familiar with a lot of those points, but when we're looking at a family unit, we cannot ignore their cultural and racial background. And that applies to everyone's family. Like, think about your own family and how your own cultural background is influencing the decisions and the behaviors and all of the things that you do now, right? Whether it's you're going against your family or you're doing kind of following along, which is a very simplistic way to put it. But just like think about that, right? So what is important to recognize when it comes to thinking about family systems in terms of race and ethnicity is to remember that racism is not just about blatant acts of hatred, right? It's not just the KKK and white, like the kind of stuff that happened in Charlottesville last year, right? It's not just those blatant acts, but racism is a system that's maintaining differences between different racial groups. And so it's important here to recognize that a lot of racism is about access to resources, access to opportunities, access to like healthcare, like things like that that feel like things that should be kind of automatic for everyone, but depending on your racial background, there's a lot of research that shows that this will be influenced differently. And if you break racial background by different groups, it will vary from one racial group to another, but also it will vary from one immigration status to another, right? So I'm an immigrant too. I'm a permanent resident, which means I have a green card, but I'm an immigrant from France or from a European country, and that comes with a lot of privilege compared to people that are immigrants from other countries. For example, when I first came to the US, I was on a student visa. And some of my friends were from Chile, which is in South America. And so automatically, as a French citizen, I was given a 5-year visa, but my friends from Chile were given a 6-month visa when we applied for the exact same programs and things, right? So that's what institutional racism often looks like. It's access to opportunities. So what it means, a visa that is not your right to stay in the country. You have other documents, but it means that if you need to, it's your paper to get in and out of the country. And so for 5 years, I was free to travel however I wanted. But my friends, if they went home after 6 months, they had to apply for a new visa to come back, even if they still had all the documents saying that they were allowed to be in the US. So that's kind of the things that are important to think about here. So how do families cope? How are families impacted by their racial and cultural background? And then another point that's important to understand, and I often tell my students this specific thing, is you cannot, so when I teach students in psychology, I really emphasize that you cannot be a multiculturally competent therapist if you don't know history and sociology, at least the basics, right? Because a lot of the struggles the people we work with are embedded in a system that's built throughout history and different social realities. And so one of the theories I use a lot in my research, I do a lot of qualitative research, so a lot of interviews, but it's critical race theory, which this is a broad theory that usually applies more to social, political sciences, law, sociology, and there's a little tiny branch of psychology that applies critical race theory, but it's the idea that racism is a reality, like an everyday reality for people of color, not just like those experiences that are kind of more blatant and violent. It's just the system is not built to serve communities of color. That's the idea behind critical race theory. Any questions about this before I move on? Okay. So when it comes to to family issues, there's a few things that I think are important to think about. So like I said, access to resources is a big one, right? no matter how much we want to say that we live in a society where everyone is equal and has access to the same things, it's not true. So think about, for example, when you applied to BYU, the kind of questions that were asked in your application, right? They probably asked about extracurricular activities, and then your SAT score, right? Like all of those informations that are actually heavily impacted by your socioeconomic background, which is impacted by your racial background. So now BYU changed the way they do admissions as of like this round of new incoming students, right? And so they don't ask you to just check boxes anymore about the things that you do, because if your parents both worked or if you came from a lower income community, right, like you probably didn't have access to all the extracurricular activities that some kids in more wealthy neighborhood will have access to. So now they use what they call a holistic approach, which talk about little essays about your experience rather than checking the box on the things that you had access to. But that's an important thing, like what does the family have access to? And then, so the two I want to talk about briefly with a little more emphasis, because that's what I'm most familiar with research-wise, is when it comes to multiracial families and transracial adoption. And that goes with colorblind racism. So a lot of the research on children in multiracial families, so meaning there's a parent from, parents are from two different races and ethnicities, those kids are kids that have a harder time like building a solid identity. And that's something that came up in my research quite a bit, but also often I talk with my siblings about it, and I have a brother that has a really hard time with it. I'm more grounded in my Black identity than my white identity because I don't look white, right? And so that's a community I relate with more, and with my experience is more consistent with Black people than white people. And often in America, when you're mixed race and one of your parents is Black, you'll be considered Black regardless of whether your other parent is white or from another race. But this is a challenge where often the kids will be expected to pick between one of the identities or the other. And so there's, again, a lot of research about that, where one side of the family will often push and ask a lot of questions about racial identity. I remember when I was about 13, my grandma, so my mom's mom, so my white grandma asked me and my siblings if we thought we were more white or Black, and we all said Black, and she said, well, I don't think you should say that because that means you're disregarding us. But to us, it was just a reality of this is the color of our skin, this is what people see when they see us, and this is what the system sees when they deal with us, right? And so that adds a lot of kind of, in adolescence, especially in early adulthood, when individuals are trying to consolidate their identity and personality, right? That's a challenge that will come pretty often, and that's often reflected in the communities differently. So not fully belonging in the white community, but also not fully belonging in the Black community, and that being reflected by comments from others and things like that. So that's one challenge that's specific to multiracial families. When it comes to transracial adoption, this is one I hear about all the time here. So in Utah, there's a lot of families that adopt, and a lot of families that adopt children of color. And one of the challenges that I hear from college students, so people about your age, is, okay, I'm a Black student, I was raised in a white family, I'm the only sibling that's Black, and my parents have a hard time understanding why I go to the Black Student Union and why I'm starting to feel passionate about race issues and things like that. And so that's a challenge that's especially stressful for individuals that are adopted in white families, because often they grow up with parents that are adopting kind of a colorblind approach to educating their child, meaning we don't see that you're black, you're just one of us, and we'll just treat you the same as your other siblings, which is great, right? And at the same time, the world is not going to treat that child the same as the parents' other siblings that are not black or whatever ethnicity or race, right? And so as the child develops an identity of their own and they start attending college and start kind of becoming more independent and kind of solidifying their own opinions and then becoming more acquainted with the community that they relate to race-wise, that creates a lot of tension with families, and they have a hard time understanding what that's about. And often they'll make it about themselves, right? What did I do wrong? Why do you've never experienced racism in your life? We've protected you from those experiences, which in reality, no, right? Because outside of home, the world is a very different place, right? And so taking a colorblind approach to race is a form of racism in itself, because it erases the experiences that are specific to the individual and not experienced by their family. So those are kind of some of the things that I think are important to think about and that I hear about in my work here at BYU with students. Do you have any questions or any thoughts or comments? Or yes?
So just like talking about transracial adoption and whatnot, and how like sometimes it'll be protected, won't discuss it. I mean, I don't know if this is like a common, like if there's common suggestions that like are, I'm trying to phrase this right, like is there something that like people should be aware of so that it's not a colorblindness? Like so if like, and you know, someone in the room one day adopts and someone of a different race, like what can they do to not be like that? So it's like when their child does start participating in like, I guess groups or things like that, that they're not like a little bit turned away or like, oh, what's this going on?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the first thing I would invite you to think about is if any of you are thinking about adoption, like the way you're thinking about it. I remember when I was in grad school, I had a friend that would always talk about wanting to adopt eventually, and she would always say, oh, I really want to adopt a little black boy. And that always kind of sat like, oh, I didn't like that, but I wasn't sure why. And then when talking about it with supervisors and friends, I realized, yeah, you don't like adopt children like you adopt puppies, right? Like it's not, oh, I want a German Shepherd, how exciting. Like this is an individual that's coming in with experiences, right? So thinking about it in terms of why am I saying this, right, is going to be important. But like it's important to reach out to the community you're adopting in. So for example, one of my friends adopted, 3 of her children are adopted, and one of them is a white little girl, and another one is a black little girl, and then she has her own, well, not own, that's a horrible way to say that, her biological son, who is white. And my friend is actually really good at, so she really quickly educated herself about black hair, for example, right? Because black hair is kind of complicated to take care of if you're not used to it, right? So she's learned how to braid her daughter's hair and like different ways to take care of her hair. And then making sure that she takes her to events where she sees representation, right? So any event that's about Black history in Utah, she'll go to, and she goes to the Genesis group, which is a church group that meets once a month. That's for Black LDS we're not supposed to say that anymore. Black members of the church, so like reaching out to the community so the child grows up knowing where they're coming from and knowing their history, and also not shying away from conversations that are painful, like this might be some of the comments you hear, or this might be what happens when you interact with law enforcement, like conversations that make us kind of feel uncomfortable, but that are necessary for children of different races, right? Like that's an important piece of it. So does that answer your question? Cool. Do you have other questions or comments or? Cool. Well, that's all I have. So.
I actually do have a question.
Yeah.
I was curious about your research when you talked about microaggressions of some of the students,
Mhm.
and this is here at BYU, right?
Yes.
Can you give us a few examples of what those look like from faculty or students?
Yes.
Just curious how that.
So, for example, one that happened last year was several black female students with braids were turned away from the testing center because they were told their hair was against the honor code. So that's kind of like maybe a macroaggression more than a microaggression. But so little comments like that are made by professors are often really stressful. The ones about affirmative action, those kind of fall into that category of microaggression, like, oh, you should apply for this program because they need more diversity. That's a microaggression. Or, oh, he's only dating you because you're exotic. That's a microaggression. Like little comments like that. Or you don't play basketball, like surprised that a black student is not an athlete, right? Like that's a microaggression. Yeah, that's kind of like the comments that are consistently reported. So, yeah.
I have a friend that says that it's not possible for like a minority to be racist. Is that true?
So, yes and no. So, racism, again, is a social concept. Like, it's not just blatant acts. So there's a difference between racism and discrimination and prejudice. So racism is a system that's giving power to the majority. So technically, it's not possible for a minority to be racist because it's not the majority in the system. However, it's absolutely possible for a minority to be prejudiced and discriminate against others. And often that's against others from a different racial group, but also internalized racism is a real thing where we'll discriminate people from our own racial groups. Does that answer your question? Yeah. So that's what, when people say it's impossible for a minority to be racist, that's what they mean. So, yeah. Other questions? Yes.
So in this class, we've learned a little bit more about like the microaggression from colorblindness. I guess it's been kind of hard for me because I'm like, I recognize a little bit of it in myself.
Yeah.
And so I'm trying to like come to grips with that, but also learn more about how I can overcome that.
Right.
So I just wonder what maybe some of your suggestions are for that.
Yeah, that's a really good question. This is a painful journey, right? To like, for all of us to have to face the things that we hope we don't do, but we actually do. So the first key here, I think, is like being kind and patient with yourself. Like just the fact that you're engaging in this journey is in itself a big deal. And then the second part is take care of your own feelings, right? Don't expect everyone else to take care of your feelings. But continue educating yourself. Like that's the only way to keep moving forward. The research on microaggressions says that the more aware you are of your own biases and behaviors, the more likely you are to actually microaggress, which is kind of discouraging. But that's because it's more like right there, like you think about it more. And so remember to look at yourself with compassion. Like this is human, this is your journey, and you're working through it. But continue educating yourself and identifying these problematic things that we all do, and then decide how to move forward. Yeah. Does that answer your question? Yeah. And then I saw another hand somewhere.
I had the same question.
Oh, okay. Cool. Yes.
So what do you tell your, you said you have like a support group
Uh-huh.
for students of color here at BYU. So what are some things that you kind of go through?
So we have a topic for each week, but whether we follow the topic or not depends on what's on people's radar that day. So we kind of go with whatever students need. But a lot of the topics we've talked about, so we've talked about racism, of course, feeling tokenized, cultural appropriation, which with Halloween coming up is a big one, where people will dress up right in the traditional clothes of other cultures, and that's really stressful for students from different cultures. So we have all of these different topics, and then we talk about how to cope with them, how to find support. We'll try to connect students to different resources. And we didn't make it a therapy group. The reason for that was because we wanted students to be able to become friends and hang out outside of, so to become their own support, which we don't usually do in therapy groups. So it's kind of open. We have new people all the time coming in, and we just try to create support that way. So.
And do you like welcome, well, I'm sure you welcome everyone, not just students of color.
Yeah, we have actually have a lot of white students that come. And yeah, it's open to anyone. Sometimes we have administrators and faculty members that come too, so yeah. And if you're interested, I can send you the flyers, and okay, and then you can pass it to the class. You had a question, and then I'll come back to you.
I actually don't know how to word my question the right way, so I'm gonna think about it.
Okay. Okay, go ahead.
So with cultural, I don't know how to say this word either, appropriation?
Appropriation?
Appropriation. How do you address that, especially with Halloween and things, like where you dress in a certain way and celebrate the differences, but like how do you, I don't know, if like say two little kids want to play cowboys and Indians and someone dresses
Right.
up as an Indian and then someone dresses up as a cowboy and they play cowboys and Indians, like is that like super wrong? Does that stress people out? Like how do we
Right.
go about that?
Yeah, so there's a huge debate about this. So like go on Twitter on Halloween Day, and then you'll get like a lot of information. But this is like a hard one because I think there's a difference between children and adults for sure, right? Like I dressed up as an Indian when I was a kid, right? And I don't look back at that with like regret necessarily. First, because I didn't know, and second, because my parents picked the costume, so they can be the ones that deal with the guilt. But I think it's more difficult when it comes from adults and peers. So for example, one that we see pretty often on campus is white students dressing up in dashikis. Do you know what that is? It's like African clothing, and then they'll say, "Oh, I served my mission in Ghana or whatever." So I'm like celebrating, but what the debate is about is the fact that a costume is first of all not a celebration, and second of all, like that's how my dad dresses, right? And when my dad would go to parent-teachers conference dressed in a dashiki and people kind of laughed when he was walking by, that was kind of hurtful. So seeing that outfit, which is traditional and has a lot of like history and things like that, being worn as a costume for like one night so people can have fun is the offensive part. So that's where I would like try to make the difference. But then I'm not as extreme as some of my friends, right? So like you'll have a different answer from everyone on this one, which is why I'm saying go on Twitter. Halloween Day, it's quite entertaining. So did you figure out your question before we wrap up?
So I just want to know kind of like what your purpose is with like research, because or like your end goal, because I don't feel like racism will ever end,
Right.
because race exists, and I don't like, is your goal to help students like cope and like, assimilate, and or is it more like, because I feel like there's kind of like a limbo sometimes, like I watch a ton of documentaries about like racism, and like I feel like there's not really a solution. So I don't know if there is one, or if it's something that just like you need to learn to cope with. Like, is that the end goal?
Yeah, so I don't think there's a solution either. There's different things that I keep in mind when I do research. So my intention is not to fix like white supremacy, right? Because that's too much of a task for me on my own. That's like a collective, everyone's task. But the first one is increasing awareness, right? Sadly, we live in a society where experience is not enough. We need data to back up people's experience. And so having data to show this is what people are experiencing. The second one is kind of giving back to my community. I grew up in a community that had a lower socioeconomic background. Like I grew up in a pretty poor neighborhood, went to pretty rough schools that didn't have a lot of funding and things like that. So giving back to my community resources, but also when I was growing up and I went through like years of school, right? Because I have a PhD and I never had a professor that was Black. And then in grad school, I never had a professor that was a woman, which is because psychology is a female-related field. And so kind of like putting a face on the experience of people is important to me. And I'm not like putting myself in the position where like I'm actually quite introverted, so I don't really like that people know who I am. And yet, like, I think it's really meaningful for students, like, to have mentors that understand their experience beyond the research. So that's kind of what I keep in mind when it comes to research. So, yeah.
I'm curious about your personal experience in France versus in the United States, because I feel like culturally it's
Yeah.
different and it's different with interaction with race and things like that, so I'm just curious about that.
Yeah, so France has a long history of colonization and being kind of one of the providers of slaves for America and for France and for England. And so a lot of race issues in France are thought about in terms of immigration, because it's people from past colonies that are going to France. And yet, I think the issues are pretty similar. We just talk about them differently. So we don't talk about racism in terms of systemic racism in France, because also France, science-wise, is also a little behind. And so it takes a while for us to catch up on like the research that's done here. But when I hear experiences from students or friends here that are Black or mixed race, right, they're pretty consistent with my experiences in France. We just talk about them differently there, so. I think we're about out of time. Maybe one more question. Yeah.
So I've had like people tell me that I got into BYU because of my race and not because of
Welcome to
whatever.
the club.
Yeah. And I'm just like wondering, like, how do you address that when people
Yeah.
say that to you?
Yeah, so this answer depends on what stage of racial identity development you're at. I'm at the stage where I'm kind of more direct than I was a few years ago. And people will still say that to you when you get a job, just so you know. So just prepare yourself. Usually I'll tell them that's offensive, like, and they'll be kind of surprised, and I'll say, I think what you're saying right now is that I'm not as smart as you are, right? Because that's what people mean by that. And then they kind of get embarrassed, and then they don't know what to do, and usually that ends the conversation. Some people are more open to discuss it, so that's great. But I'm more comfortable now than I was like 6 years ago, kind of calling people out on it. But I'll tell people, yeah, that's like a really offensive thing to say, because what you're saying is that I'm not as smart as you are, or as smart as everyone else is here. And so that's usually what I'll try to do. Also, I'm like a big believer in pick your battles. So if it's someone like I'll never see again, I'll usually be like, okay, see ya. But if it's someone that I'm gonna interact with in the future, I'll try to be more engaged in the conversation, depending on my energy level, of course. But yeah, I don't know if that's a satisfactory answer. But also BYU, like if universities that comply with affirmative action, like it's not just, again, people don't understand what affirmative action is. It's not people seeing, oh, Black, I'm not even gonna read the rest of their application, they're in. Like it's more complex than that. So just tell people to go on the internet and educate themselves. I say that quite often too, Google it. So, yeah. Cool. Well, thank you for having me. You had really good questions. So thank you.